So now that we understand what arrays are and the basic functionality of them, how to create them, how to manipulate them, how to get values from them, let's dive a little bit deeper into what's possible with arrays. So if I scroll down in the documentation, the first thing I want to mention is that there is a fill function. So if you want to fill an array with a default value, you can use the array.fill, pass in your array ID, and then the value you want to fill that array with. But the main thing I want to focus on here next is looping through array elements. So let's copy this code and jump over into the Pine editor. Now, just looking at this, I think this is a terrible example of how to loop through arrays, to be honest with you. It's just confusing. Let's get rid of this and we'll start our own example code. So we already know that arrays can be dynamically sized. So let's get rid of this input. And for now, we'll just hard code our array size. So let's create a var array. We'll call it loop array. And it will be set to array.new_float, and we'll give it an index of, let's say 10. And let's set every initial value of our numbers to 0.0. And then on the last bar, let's create a new label that just displays the array size. So save my code. There we go. Array size of 10. Now let's loop through our array and do something with it. So we'll create a for loop here. I'll say here for I equals 0 to array.size and then pass in our loop array. Then hit enter and indent. And now let's set each value of our array to our loop counter. So actually, let me change this to an int. Let's do something different. We'll start with an int array, 10 values. Each value begins at, let's try -1. And let me comment out this for loop for a moment. And we'll create a new variable here called array string. And I'll just set this to a blank string for now. And I'll add it on the end of our array size label. I'll say array string, and then we'll add array string to the end. So now when I save my code, it should compile fine. There we go. We have a blank array string here. And actually, let's change this to a tooltip. Tooltip equals, and I'll paste that in there. There we go. Save my code. Now when we hover over our label, we should get our array string popping up. There we go. And it's blank for now. So now let's loop through our array and let's set array.set our loop array. We'll set the value of I being our index. That's our for loop index. And then we'll set the value of that index to I. So what this should do in theory is fill our array with I as it loops. So the first index will be 0, then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. until we get to our array size. So let me save that code. And we have an error here because I need to subtract 1 from our array size. I forgot about that. So now when I save my code, this should work just fine. There we go. Array size is 10. And we should have looped through our array and set each index to our for loop index. Now let's create a second for loop here, and we'll do the same thing. I equals 0 to array.size loop array -1. But this time, let's set our array string to array string plus, and then I'll open a new string, \n to start a new line. And then I'm going to add or concatenate our array value to this string. So I'll say here str.toString array.get loop array, comma I. So now we should be adding to our array string a list of our array values using the array.get function. So now when I save my code, hopefully this compiles. There we go. Now when I hover my mouse over our label, we should get a list of all of the array values in our string. So let's try that now. There we go. That is what is contained in our array. 10 values ranging from 0 to 9. So if we wanted to manipulate this a bit, let's try multiplying I by 2. Save the code. Hover over. Now we're getting 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, and so on. So that is how you loop through array values. And all of the array functions behave just the same as they would in any other context when dealing with them in this manner. You can also access them through while loops. I won't bother showing you how to do that because it's the same concept here, except that you would need to create your while index So something like that. While index is less than array.size loop array -1, increment while index by 1, and then you do whatever you need to do with your array, referencing the while index the same way we do our for loop index. But anyway, before we wrap up this lesson, let's experiment with scope a little bit. So arrays can also be used within scopes the same way any other variable can be used. So for example, we could cut this out, paste it in the scope of this is last if statement. I can cut this, put it in there, take this out, put it in the scope of our if statement, cut this for loop and throw it on the bottom here. And now this should also compile just fine. And we should be getting exactly the same thing on our chart. There we go. So now our array doesn't exist in the global scope of our total script, but rather only within the if statement scope here. And so if we try to reference this outside of this if statement, the script will not compile. So scopes work exactly the same way with arrays. For loops, while loops behave pretty much the same way with arrays, with the main difference being that a while loop doesn't have a counter. So you need to create that manually if you are going to reference values inside your array. And that is pretty much it for looping through arrays. I'll leave the source code to this below the video for you to play around with if you are interested in experimenting with this a little further. I'll also comment this a little bit better. Create array, generate array string, loop through array and assign values, loop through array and add values to string, and then finally display array values. And that will do it for today's lesson. I will speak with you in the next one.